Welcome back to Snail Story. What would you do if the home you and your husband built together was suddenly put up for sale only so he could provide for his mistress and children who weren't even yours? Today's story is about Laura Benita, woman who seemed fragile, yet calmly laid a single envelope on the table. That envelope marked the beginning of a counter-strike so powerful, it brought both her husband and his mistress to ruin Evan on their wedding day. Stay with us to hear how Laura faced betrayal and turned it into strength. And if you believe that sometimes losing everything is just the chance to start again, don't forget to like and subscribe so we can meet here every week for more heartfelt stories on Snail Story. Helen Crawford stood in the kitchen, inhaling deeply the rich aroma of the roasting turkey, a fragrance tied to her childhood memories of Christmas. The clock on the wall was nearing 7 o'clock, the whole house aglow with warm golden lights, windows draped in twinkling garlands. She had spent nearly a week preparing every dish carefully chosen, every tablecloth ironed crisp. Tonight, the family would gather together again at least. That was what Helen had believed. On the long dining table, her late mother's silver-rimmed porcelain set was laid out. Small red candles flickered among a wreath of pine and artificial berries. Helen was adjusting the placement of the final spoon when she heard the door open. Daniel walked in, tall and composed in a simple but neat suit, his face showing traces of fatigue after a year of relentless work at the law firm. "Hi, Mom," he said, giving her a brief hug, the scent of pine lingering from his coat. "Everything looks wonderful, just like every year." Helen smiled, warmth flooding her chest. "As long as you're home, Daniel, it's all I want. Just one meal with everyone here." Less than 10 minutes later, Lily burst into the house, arms full of gift bags, chattering excitedly about her psychology classes. The young woman brought an air of vitality, her cheeks flushed pink from the cold. Helen watched her two children hang up their coats and laughed softly, feeling that every bit of effort had been worth it. Only Richard, her husband, remained in the living room, eyes glued to the glow of his phone screen. Through the doorway, Helen caught sight of his lips curving in a faint smile as he read a message. A rare smile, but not one meant for her. "Richard," Helen called gently, her voice still laced with patience. "Would you help me carry the turkey to the table?" He paused for a moment, then slipped the phone into his jacket pocket. "Yeah, I'll take care of it." Helen handed him the heavy roasting pan, feeling the distance in every small motion. For months now, Richard had been busy with work, coming home late, shutting himself away in his study. Helen tried not to think too much of it, but peace had eluded her heart for a long time. When everyone finally sat at the table, Daniel and Lily's laughter filled the room. Helen poured the wine, silently telling herself, "Let tonight be whole. Just once." "Merry Christmas," Lily said, lifting her glass, eyes sparkling. "Thank you, Mom, for making everything perfect. The mashed potatoes smell amazing." Daniel nodded in agreement. "There's no restaurant that can compare to Mom's Christmas dinner." Helen chuckled, raising her glass with them. For a moment, her heart eased. Just then, Richard abruptly set down his knife and fork, the clang of metal on porcelain sharp and jarring. He rose to his feet, straightening his back, his shoulders tightening in that all-too-familiar way. The sign that he was about to make a weighty announcement. "I have something to say," Richard declared. His voice was cold, laced with the authority of a man accustomed to being in charge. Daniel and Lily froze, eyes lifting toward him. Helen's chest fluttered with unease, but she remained silent. "I've decided to sell this house," Richard said slowly, as though outlining a business plan. "Marissa and her children need a bigger place. This home will no longer suit us." In an instant, everything went still. The ticking of the wall clock echoed unbearably loud. Daniel dropped his fork, eyes widening. "Dad, what did you just say?" Lily's face drained of color, her lips trembling. "Marissa, who is Marissa?" Helen straightened her back, her hands clasping tightly beneath the table. She had expected this moment eventually, but she hadn't thought Richard would be brazen enough to declare it in front of their children's night of all times. He went on, his tone disturbingly casual. "Marissa Collins. We've been seeing each other for a while. She has 2 children, and they deserve a stable home. I think it's time for change." "Change?" Lily's voice cracked. "Change means abandoning Mom, abandoning us." Richard avoided his daughter's eyes, lifting his chin instead, as though he were making a rational, justified decision. Helen drew a long breath and suddenly rose to her feet. She did not cry, did not raise her voice. She simply walked toward the kitchen. All eyes followed her, expecting her to leave. But Helen returned, carrying a small leather purse. She set a cream-colored envelope directly in front of Richard, right on the spot where he had just spilled turkey gravy. "You made your announcement," Helen said, her tone quiet but firm. "Now I have one of my own." The air thickened instantly. Daniel and Lily stared at their mother, then at the envelope, as if it were some inscrutable secret. Richard hesitated, his usual arrogance flickering for the first time. Helen sat back, down lifted her glass, and took a small sip of wine. In the candlelight, her face was strangely serene, while the room pulsed with shock. Outside the window, snow had begun to fall, blanketing the front yard in white. A Christmas that had been prepared to unite the family had just turned into a point of no return. The room sank into silence after Helen's words. The small red candles on the table still burned, casting a wavering glow across each tense face. Daniel stared fixedly at his father, while Lily bit her lips so hard it bled. Richard stood there, trying to maintain composure, but the hand gripping the back of the chair had turned white. "Dad, what exactly did you mean by that?" Daniel asked, his voice low and steady. The sharp gaze of a young lawyer suited the anger he was struggling to swallow. Richard exhaled, forcing his tone into the calm cadence of a man explaining a contract. "Your mother and I, we've grown too far apart. We no longer share the same path. Marissa, enough." Lily shouted, her glass slamming against the table. Red wine spilled across the white cloth like blood spreading through snow. "You really plan to shatter our Christmas like this? Right in front of Mom, right in front of us." Richard faltered for a moment, then quickly regained his confident posture. "Lily, you must understand. Sometimes adults, I don't need to understand anything." Lily burst into tears, rising to her feet, her chair screeching across the wooden floor. "Do you even realize how much Mom prepared for this dinner? Do you know how much she longed for us to be together tonight?" "And you," Helen quietly set her glass down, not stopping her daughter. She only looked at Richard, her eyes sharp as blades. Daniel stood and grasped his sister's shoulders, steadying her. He turned toward his father, his voice firm. "The fact that you chose to announce this way means you've been planning it for a while. But what about Mom? Did you ever think about how she would feel?" Richard said nothing. For a fleeting second, the mask of the powerful CEO slipped, revealing a man unsettled. Avoiding his son's gaze, Helen let out a dry laugh and leaned forward to scoop another spoonful of mashed potatoes. Her voice was calm, yet each word cut like steel. How strange. The man who once promised to build a lasting home for his family now treats that home like a commodity to be sold off, traded for a new life with another woman. Richard blinked, lips parting, but no words emerged. "What's in the envelope, Mom?" Daniel asked, suspicion glinting in his eyes. Helen glanced at her son, then smiled faintly. "Something that will keep us safe, Daniel. As for the details, let your father discover them himself." She straightened her back and continued eating, as if the confrontation had never taken place. That calmness only made Richard more uneasy. He had never seen Helen like this, no yelling, no demands. Just silence heavy enough to feel like a sentence. Lily sat back down, still trembling, her eyes red and wet. "Mom, are you all right?" Helen squeezed her daughter's hand gently, offering a soft smile. "I'm fine, Lily. Don't worry about me." Just remember, family isn't always the people who share your name. Family is the place where someone stands with you, no matter what. Daniel nodded slowly, fists clenched tight. He turned to his father. "If you think we'll support this decision, you're gravely mistaken. You just lost the last shred of my respect." Richard's face paled. He opened his mouth to speak, but at that moment his phone rang. The screen lit up with a familiar name. Marissa. The air thickened again. Lily hissed under her breath. Perfect. Right in the middle of Christmas dinner. Richard hurried to decline the call, setting the phone down, his face flushed. This is work. He stammered. Helen let out a soft laugh, a cold, cutting laugh that sent a chill through the room. What kind of company requires its top executive to take calls from his mistress on Christmas night? Daniel clenched the lapels of his jacket, staring at his father as though at a stranger. Lily turned away, tears spilling silently down her cheeks. Helen rose again, gathering a few dirty plates. She moved with the composure of someone who had just been freed. When she returned, her eyes locked on Richard, her voice clear and deliberate. "Richard, you may have ruined this dinner, but you will not ruin me. And you will not destroy what I've prepared for this day." Richard's fingers brushed against the envelope again, but he didn't open it. He could command employees and partners with ease, but faced with Helen's unnerving calm, a tremor ran through him. Outside, the church bells rang across the frozen night. Inside, the three of them, mother and children, ate close together, while Richard stood isolated at the head of the table, like an uninvited guest. The Christmas dinner, instead of uniting, had drawn a sharp dividing line. Those who stood with Helen and the one who had chosen to walk away. Helen whispered, just loud enough for Richard to hear, "This is only the beginning." Helen sat in the living room, the Christmas lights outside the window flickering against the glass of wine in her hand. After that fateful dinner, Daniel and Lily had retreated to their rooms, leaving their father alone in his study. The house, she knew so well, had never felt so heavy. Yet instead of panic, Helen felt her mind clearer than it had ever been. All the scattered fragments of the past months suddenly fit together into a complete picture. It had all begun in the spring. Richard had suddenly started coming home late more often, citing urgent meetings or client dinners. At the time, Helen still trusted him completely, patiently reheating the food, setting it out on the table, waiting for him to return. But the meals grew colder, the conversations shorter. He had taken to showering immediately upon getting home, no longer settling onto the couch to watch the news and ask her the simple question he always had: "How was your day?" The first flicker of suspicion came in April. It was their wedding anniversary. Helen had reserved a table at the restaurant they'd visited right after they were married. But an hour before they were to leave, Richard called to cancel. "Have to meet a client. Something important came up. We'll celebrate another time." Helen ended the call without a word, then went to the restaurant alone, staring at the two-person table with one chair empty. Then came Lily's birthday, when Richard arrived nearly 2 hours late. When Lily scolded him lightly, he just shrugged. "Traffic jam, sweetheart." But Helen knew well that at that time of day, the road from his office to home was never congested. She tried to dismiss it, to reassure herself that he was simply too consumed with work. Until one evening, when her phone charger broke, she borrowed Richard's phone to check the time. A message lit up the screen. "The kids and I got home safely. Thank you for this afternoon. Signed, Marissa." Helen's heart raced wildly. She quietly set the phone down, pretending not to have seen it. But from that moment, suspicion gnawed at every corner of her being. In June, An old colleague mentioned it casually over coffee. I saw Richard in the park on Sunday, with a younger woman and 2 kids. They looked like a family. Helen had forced a stiff smile, feigned indifference. But that night, lying beside Richard, she felt the gulf between them stretch into an ocean. She began to watch more closely. Strange expenses appeared on their bank statements. Purchases of children's toys. Dinners at upscale restaurants she had never visited. When she asked, Richard replied smoothly, "Entertaining clients, you know how it is." Once, she found a receipt in the pocket of his suit jacket, children's bunk bed blue. Helen froze, staring at the slip of paper. Daniel's old room was still intact. The bunk bed, unused for years. So who is that bed for? The breaking point came at the end of summer. One afternoon, Helen brought pastries to Richard's office as a surprise. She stopped short at the glass wall. Inside, Richard sat across from a young blonde woman, Marisa. They leaned close, eyes locked with an intimacy no colleague could share. Outside, Helen stood with a bag of pastries sagging in her hand, as though it had slipped away. She didn't step inside. She just turned away silently, the hot wind across her face feeling like a slap. That night, when Richard came home, Helen said nothing. She simply looked at him with calm composure. But inside, she had already resolved. She would prepare for the day he announced it. In the months that followed, Helen quietly gathered evidence. Photos taken from a distance of Richard, with Marisa and her 2 children in the park, receipts for children's clothing, even saved messages. She never confronted him, never screamed. She only filed everything neatly into a folder and placed it in the hands of Thomas Hale, attorney a trusted friend had recommended. After reviewing it, Thomas looked up at her. "Are you certain you want to go down this path? It won't be easy." Helen answered softly, yet her gaze was steel. "I've lived my whole life for my husband and children. Now it's time to live for myself, and for Daniel and Lily. I need to protect them." Thomas nodded, his large hand closing the folder. "Then we begin. But let him believe you're still oblivious. The decisive blow comes from surprise." From then on, Helen became a perfect actress. She still cooked meticulous dinners, still smiled when Richard spoke of work. But behind the scenes were secret trips to Thomas's office, documents transferring property titles, plans carefully laid for the day Richard exposed his own betrayal. So on Christmas night, when Richard calmly announced to the family that he would sell the house to live with Marisa and her children, Helen was not shocked. She only felt the completion of a circle, from subtle suspicions to painful confirmation. To the moment he dug his own grave, the cream envelope she had placed before him at the dinner table was more than a stack of papers. It was the product of months of quiet observation, preparation, and resolve. It was the declaration that Helen Crawford was no longer the silent, suffering wife. Outside, the winter wind howled against the glass, but inside Helen, for the first time in months, there was a sense of control. She knew this was only the beginning of a new battle, and she was ready. After that fateful Christmas night, the Crawford house still glowed with holiday lights as in years past, but inside it was colder than ice. Richard buried himself in his phone, consumed with the new life he was sketching out with Marisa. Daniel and Lily kept their distance, speaking to their father in clipped, detached sentences. Only Helen seemed unnervingly calm. She no longer tried to hold on. Instead, day by day, she quietly prepared for a counterstrike Richard would never see coming. One early January morning, Helen stepped into Thomas Hale's office. The space was bright, lined with dark wooden bookshelves, the scent of old paper mingling with strong coffee. Thomas rose to greet her, tall and steady, his deep voice reassuring. "You're here. I've gone through the file you sent me. It's enough to begin." Helen sat down, her hands clasped together. "I don't want a spectacle. I just need to make sure that when he leaves, he can't destroy what I and the children have built." Thomas nodded, sliding a stack of documents across to her. "First step, the house. This is the most valuable asset. I've prepared papers to transfer the title solely into your name. If you sign today, I'll take care of the rest. He won't know until it's too late." Helen looked at the printed words. The house where she had raised Daniel and Lily, where family photographs once filled the walls, was now a battlefield. She drew a breath and signed. The scratch of pen on paper sounded like the turn of a lock, sealing a decision from which there was no return. Thomas continued. "Step 2. Finances. We need to track his spending. He's surely using marital funds for Marissa. I'll have every transaction from the past 6 months examined." Helen reached into her bag and pulled out a stack of neatly prepared documents. "I've already started. Here are the bank statements, receipts, invoices, even the purchases for children's items. He thinks I don't notice, but I've recorded everything." Thomas studied her, respect flickering in his eyes. "You're sharper and more patient than he realizes. That will be your greatest advantage." Helen gave a faint smile, tinged with bitterness. "I've played the dutiful wife all my life. Now it's different. If he wants to treat me as naive, I'll let him walk right into his own trap." From that day forward, Helen lived 2 parallel lives. To Richard, she remained the gentle wife serving dinners, exchanging polite words. But once he left the house, she went to Thomas's office, combing through every detail with him. Once, Thomas handed her a set of photos from a private investigator, Richard, holding Marissa's hand as they walked out of a jewelry store. Helen stared at the image for a long while, her chest tightening. But her voice was steady. "Good. If he's buying a ring, that only makes his intent to abandon me more obvious." In the evenings, Helen sat in her study, arranging each piece of evidence into files, numbering them carefully. The bunk bed receipt, a photo of Richard carrying Marissa's daughter on his shoulders. The bank statements with their strange expenses all lined up like chess pieces, ready for the final match. Daniel and Lily began to notice the change. One night, Lily knocked on her mother's door and found Helen making notes in the thick folder. "Mom, what are you working on?" she whispered. Helen closed the file and smiled. "Just putting things in order, sweetheart. I want to make sure we don't get left in the chaos." Lily sat beside her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "I'm worried about you. I've never seen you this calm. It's almost frightening." Helen squeezed her daughter's hand, whispering, "Sometimes calmness is the strongest way to survive." Meanwhile, Richard remained oblivious. He was busy plotting the sale of the house, hunting for a suburban estate with Marissa. He bragged to Daniel about a great real estate investment opportunity, but his son only gave curt replies. When he boasted to Lily about a big garden for the kids to play in, she coldly walked out of the room. Helen watched it all, but did not interfere. She let Richard stride confidently along the path he thought he controlled. Because she knew, when the envelope was finally opened, everything would collapse. One night, after Richard had gone to bed, Helen went down to the kitchen, sitting by the window to watch the snow fall. Memories flooded back. The day they moved into this house, the laughter of her children, evenings by the fire. All of those moments now stood at a crossroads, either buried under betrayal or preserved by her resolve and clarity. Helen placed a hand on her handbag where a second envelope always rested. Another envelope besides the one she had already laid before Richard at Christmas dinner. Inside were duplicate documents, evidence, and the legal plan Thomas had prepared. It was her secret weapon, kept aside for when the battle turned fierce. In the hush of the winter night, Helen murmured to herself, "Richard, you think you're winning, but you've forgotten I know how to play this game too." On Monday morning, Richard left the house with unease gnawing at him. His face no longer carried the arrogant smugness it once had. Helen had noticed that ever since the Christmas dinner, his hand often slipped into his jacket pocket, brushing against the cream-colored envelope as though it might explode at any moment. Yet he still hadn't opened it. That night, when the house had gone quiet, Richard sat alone in his study. The desk lamp cast a pale golden light across his weary face. Finally, he drew out the envelope, his hand trembling. Sweat beaded on his forehead. Slowly, he tore through the thick paper. The rip of the paper echoed like thunder in the silence. Inside was a stack of documents stamped with red seals, bearing Helen's signature and that of a lawyer. Richard read, line by line, his eyes widening, his face draining of color. Transfer of full ownership of the Crawford residence to Helen Crawford, unilateral. The bold black print slammed into him, choking the air from his lungs. He flipped the pages back and forth, desperate for some mistake, but everything was airtight, legal, notarized, certified. The house, the very asset he had promised Marissa as the cornerstone of their future, was no longer his. Richard let the papers fall, slumping into his chair. In that moment, the man who had once been a commanding CEO was nothing more than a defeated figure shaking in the dark. Suddenly, his phone rang. The screen lit up with the familiar name, Marissa. He hesitated, then answered. Her voice was bright, eager. "Richard, I just told the kids about the new house. They're so excited. Elise wants a pink bedroom, and Max keeps asking when he'll get his bunk bed. Have you started the paperwork yet?" Richard swallowed hard, his voice hoarse. "Marissa, there's something. What is it?" she asked. Lightly, still oblivious. He stayed silent too long. On the other end, her tone sharpened. "Don't tell me there's a problem. Richard, you promised me. I've invested so much trust in your words. And now, the house," Richard stammered. "It's not in my name anymore. Helen transferred it to herself. I can't sell it." Silence. Then, a bitter laugh crackled through the line. "You're joking, right?" A CEO, a 52-year-old man, letting his wife outsmart him like a child. "Richard, do you really think I'd stay with someone who can't keep a single promise? Marissa, please. Just listen. No need." She screamed, her voice breaking with rage. "You've made me and my kids into a joke. I believed you could give us a home, and all you have is empty promises. I'm done with you." The call ended with a harsh click. Richard sat frozen, the phone slipping from his hand onto the floor, upstairs in her bedroom. Helen had heard every shattered piece of that conversation. She didn't need the details to know Marissa had done exactly what she expected. Abandon Richard the moment the dream of a new house crumbled. The next morning, breakfast was tense. Richard entered the kitchen with dark circles under his eyes, his tie knotted hastily. Daniel glanced up from his newspaper, his gaze cold as ice. "Late night, Dad? Or is it that someone isn't answering your calls anymore?" Richard glared at his son, but stayed silent. Lily, pouring milk, gave a bitter little smile. "I heard winters are harsh on people left out in the cold. What a shame." Helen set a plate of toast on the table, her voice soft as a breeze. "Your coffee, Richard? Careful, before it goes cold. Just like the promises you once made." He snatched the cup and drained it in one gulp, as if trying to swallow his humiliation. But inside, every word from his wife and children pierced him like knives. All day, Richard tried to call Marissa back. His messages piled up, unanswered. That night, he parked outside her apartment, waiting for the lights to flicker on. But the windows stayed dark. A neighbor passing by said coldly, "She moved out." Today, the news fell like a final blow. Richard returned to the Crawford house, the front door opening onto the warm light of the living room. But that warmth was no longer his. Daniel and Lily sat with their mother, flipping through old family photos. They laughed, they shared, while Richard stood outside, feeling himself erased from the picture. Helen looked up and saw him through the doorway. She didn't speak, only drew her children closer, letting him understand his place in this family. Portrait was gone. That night, Richard tossed in bed. Beside him lay the crumpled, empty envelope. He knew he had lost everything: his mistress, his future, even the very home he thought was his to control. Meanwhile, in her own room, Helen slept, more peacefully than she had in years. She knew the war was far from over, but the first victory was hers. On Sunday morning, the pale winter sun streamed through the dining room window, glinting on the old wooden table marked by years of family meals. Helen laid out a simple breakfast: pancakes, strawberry jam, and steaming coffee. The scene looked peaceful, but everyone at the table knew a boundary had been drawn. Daniel sat across from his father, eyes pensive behind his glasses. Folding his newspaper, he spoke in a calm yet resolute tone. "I've thought about this carefully." "Dad, what you've done, I cannot accept." Richard lifted his head, his face wan after a sleepless night. "Daniel, I know you're angry, but you'll understand eventually. Your mother and our marriage has been dead for years. Marissa just gave me a new chance." Daniel gave a cold, bitter laugh. "A new chance? By destroying the old one. Do you even realize how Mom has kept this house standing? She cared for us, hid her exhaustion, made sure that whenever you came home, there was warmth waiting for you. And in return, you brought Marissa into Christmas dinner and declared you would sell everything. You call that a chance?" Richard started to answer, but the sharpness in his son's eyes cut him off. Lily, sitting beside them, her eyes still rimmed red, set her spoon down. Her voice trembled, but her words were firm. "I once thought you were the model of what a man should be: strong, protective of his family. But that night when you said her name in front of us, I knew you were no longer the man I once admired." Richard reached a hand toward her, but Lily pulled back. Her gaze filled with hurt and resolve. Helen sat quietly, stirring her coffee. She didn't intervene. This was between father and children's, something she had known was coming. Something necessary? She only watched, letting Richard see for himself what he had lost. Daniel leaned back in his chair and continued. "You could have chosen anyone, Dad, but you chose to humiliate Mom at our table. No apology, no consideration. From that moment, you severed your bond with us." Richard slammed his hand on the table, his voice sharp. "You don't understand. I sacrificed my whole life to reach this position. I have the right to seek happiness. For myself." Helen looked up, her voice even and steady. "You have the right to seek happiness, Richard. You don't have the right to use others as the foundation for that selfish happiness. You don't have the right to treat your children as pawns in your game." Her words froze the room. Richard opened his mouth, but no reply came. Lily rose to her feet, shoulders shaking, but her eyes blazing. "I choose to stand with Mom. I can't pretend nothing happened. Dad, I'm sorry, but I no longer respect you." Daniel stood too, his voice deep and unwavering. "Me as well. From now on, I'll protect Mom even if that means standing against you." Richard watched as his two children, his own blood, turned their backs on him. Their footsteps echoed up the stairs, leaving him alone at the table. In that moment, for the first time, Richard felt the full weight of emptiness. No Marissa, no respect from his children, not even the house. Everything had slipped away. Helen remained seated, quietly sipping her coffee. In the morning light, her face was strangely serene. She felt neither glee nor sorrow, only certainty. She had weathered the storm, and now she knew she stood firm. That night, Helen entered Lily's room. Her daughter was curled up in bed, eyes swollen from tears. Helen stroked her hair, whispering, "You don't have to be strong for me. Be honest with your feelings." Lily clung to her mother, sobbing, "Mom, I'm just afraid that we'll lose everything." Helen shook her head gently. "No, sweetheart, we only lost someone who chose to leave. What remains is a sand that's enough to make a family." In the next room, Daniel sat at his desk, turning over the file Helen had given him. He didn't speak much, but his eyes burned with determination. He had seen his mother quietly prepare, had seen her face betrayal with composure. Now it was his turn to rise, to show Richard that in any legal or financial battle, Helen would never stand alone. That night, the Crawford house was silent. Helen sat alone in the living room, gazing at the fading Christmas tree, its pine needles, scattering across the carpet. But instead of sorrow, she felt peace. The tree would wither, but new roots were already taking hold in her heart and in her children's. Upstairs, Richard paced his room, dialing Daniel, then Lily. Neither answered. He sent dozens of messages, met only with silence. And when he looked into the mirror, he saw only an aging, hollow man abandoned by the very family that once defined him. Helen quietly closed the living room door and whispered to herself, "The game has only just begun. But this time, I am no longer a pawn on your board." After Marissa left, Richard became a shadow of himself. In the early days of February, he no longer strode to work in a sharp suit with confidence. Each morning, Helen saw him sitting quietly in his car in the driveway, phone in hand, waiting for a call that never came. It wasn't until the third week that Marissa finally picked up. The call took place in his study. But even from the foot of the stairs, Helen could hear her cold voice crackling through the speaker. "Richard, I don't want to drag this out. I have children. I need stability. If you can't give me that, it's better we end this now." Richard panicked. "I can give you that, I promise. We'll get married soon as possible. I'll take care of everything, the house, the papers, the wedding, and we'll have a child together." There was a pause. Then Marissa's tone softened, though still tinged with doubt. "Are you serious?" "Never more serious, Richard," replied, his voice urgent, clinging as if to his last lifeline. Helen closed her eyes when she heard it. She wasn't surprised. After losing the house and his children's respect, Richard clung to Marissa as his only life raft. He would promise anything to keep her. The next day, Richard made it official. "Helen, I'll be filing for divorce as soon as possible. Marissa and I will be married this spring." Helen looked up from her book, her tone calm. "That's your choice. I won't stop you." "But Richard," she paused, fixing her gaze on him, her voice deliberate. "Are you sure you can keep the promises you're making her?" Richard frowned, then looked away. He didn't know that Helen held a secret he had buried for more than 2 decades. Helen remembered it vividly. When Lily was born under difficult circumstances, Richard had secretly gone to see their family doctor, Harold Simmons, for a fertility check. When he came home, he only said, "Everything's fine," then changed the subject. Helen hadn't thought much of it, blaming herself for not being able to have more children after Daniel and Lily. Years later, while cleaning an old drawer, she stumbled upon the medical slip. The conclusion stated that Richard's fertility had been severely impaired after surgery in his youth. He had hidden it, letting Helen carry the guilt for years. That paper weighed heavily in her memory until the day she handed it to Thomas Hale. "This information will change the entire board," Thomas had said, his eyes sharp. "If he's promising children to keep his mistress, this becomes a ticking bomb. All we have to do is wait for the right moment." Helen nodded, tucking the paper into a separate envelope. There was no rush. She knew one day Richard would hand himself over by March. The news spread. Richard Crawford and Marissa Collins would hold a small wedding in April. The announcement appeared in a local society magazine. with a photo of the couple's smiling hands, entwined as if ready for their future. Daniel slammed the magazine onto the table, his face dark. He has no shame. Divorce papers not even filed, and he's already parading a new wedding. Lily laughed bitterly, though the smile held no warmth. Let's see if he can keep this promise. Helen stayed silent, sipping her tea. Inside, she knew the time was drawing near. Richard threw every ounce of strength left into the wedding. He wanted to prove to Maurice and to the world that he was still in control of his life. Each day he called wedding services, ordered flowers, picked rings, booked a grand hotel reception. Helen observed it all, detached like an outsider. Once Richard slipped up in front of the children. "Marissa wants a real family, with a child of our own. I'll give her that." Daniel froze. "Dad, are you sure?" Richard scowled. "Of course. Why wouldn't I be?" Lily let out a sharp, mocking laugh. "Because sometimes, Dad, what you promise is nothing but illusion." Richard growled and stormed out of the room. But Helen had seen the flicker of unease in his eyes. Deep down, he still remembered the test result he had buried his secret shame. The night before the engagement party, Helen met Thomas at their usual cafe. He slid an envelope across the table, neatly sealed with a legal stamp. "This is the complete medical record. I've ensured everything is admissible and ready to use at any time." Helen laid her hand on the envelope, feeling its chill seep into her skin. She drew a long breath, nodding. "Keep it until the wedding day. When every eye is watching, the truth will reveal itself." Thomas studied her closely. "Are you sure? You can bear this. It will be the final blow." Helen's reply was calm but unyielding. "I endured his silence for 20 years. Now it's his turn to endure the truth. That's fair." When Richard slipped a ring onto Marissa's finger, in front of a handful of close friends at City Hall, Helen stood in the hallway, watching through the glass door. His face glowed with forced radiance, but his hands trembled. Helen thought, "This man is building a castle of sand, and all it will take is one small wave to wash it away." In that moment, she felt no gloating triumph, only relief. For at last, she was no longer the woman waiting at home with cold dinners and empty hopes. She was the one holding the key to end the game, and she knew the end was coming soon. On the morning of the wedding, the Westfield Hotel glittered as if preparing for a grand festival. White roses lined the aisle. The string quartet tuned their instruments, and staff hurried between rows of chairs draped in satin. Richard stood in the preparation room, staring at himself in the mirror. His black tuxedo fit perfectly. His tie was straight, but his eyes sagged with dark circles. He forced a smile, trying to believe today would mark a new beginning. In another room, Marissa slipped into an elaborate lace gown. Tilting her head before the mirror, she smiled faintly. Yet in her eyes flickered calculation. Today wasn't just a wedding. It was the day she and her children secured a stable life. On one condition, Richard had to keep his promise of a child. Amid the bustle, a hotel staff member approached Richard with a thick envelope stamped by the court. He frowned, but tore it open. Just a few lines in, his face drained of color. Medical examination result: Richard Crawford, severe reproductive impairment, near total infertility. The documents were neatly arranged, bearing official seals dated more than 20 years ago. A fully legitimate copy, impossible to deny. Richard's hands shook, cold sweat running down his spine. He muttered, "No, this can't be." At that moment, Marissa entered. Seeing his pallor, she approached. "Richard, what's wrong?" He tried to hide the papers, but she snatched them away. Within seconds, her face shifted from shock to fury to contempt. "So this is what you hid from me," she hissed. "You promised me a child, when in reality you've been incapable for over 20 years. Marissa, there's still hope. Medicine today is advanced. We can enough. She hurled the papers to the floor, sheets scattering across the room. You expect me and my children to tie ourselves to a liar? You promised just to keep me, but you have nothing. No house, no child, no future. Her voice carried down the hallway. Curious guests peered in, murmuring as they caught sight of the scattered documents. The words infertility, impaired reproductive function blazed like stains that could never be scrubbed away. Richard lunged forward, pleading, Marissa, please, don't go. I can make it up to you. I love you. She shook his hand off, her eyes like ice. Love doesn't feed my children. And you, Richard, can't even keep your own promises. She turned sharply, her gown sweeping the carpet, leaving Richard collapsed amid the wreckage of paper. The door slammed behind her, sealing the air thick with failure. News of Maurice's departure spread like wildfire. Guests whispered, some quietly slipped away. In the ballroom, the music fell silent. Rows of chairs stood abandoned. People would forever remember Richard Crawford's wedding that never happened as a bitter joke. Richard stumbled into the hallway, his face ashen. He felt the sting of pitying stares, heard the murmurs. The CEO who lost his wife and his mistress, what humiliation, each word cut deep. At the far end, Helen stood quietly in a simple blue dress. She hadn't come to celebrate, only to witness. Her gaze held no gloating, only a calm detachment. When Richard saw his former wife, his back seemed to bend under invisible weight. As though the world had settled on his shoulders, Helen stepped forward, picked up a stray document near her feet, and handed it to him. Richard, you chose silence, letting me blame myself for not being able to bear more children. For 20 years, I carried that shame. Now the truth has finally found the one who must carry it. His hands trembled, his eyes red. Helen, it was you? Helen didn't answer. She only looked straight at him. Don't ask me. The question isn't what I did, but what you did to end up here. She turned and walked out into the cold air. The wind lifted her hair, but inside, Helen felt warmth. She hadn't destroyed Richard. He had destroyed himself with his own lies. That evening, Helen sat by the window of the Crawford home, looking at the fading Christmas lights still clinging outside. Daniel and Lily sat beside her, each holding a mug of hot tea. Daniel spoke softly. I heard. The wedding fell apart before it even began. Lily let out a short laugh, tinged with bitterness. Maybe in the end, Dad finally paid the price. Helen looked at her children, her heart lighter. I don't wish him misery. I only wished for the truth to stop being hidden. And now, we can start again, without burdens, without lies. Outside, snow fell thick and white. Inside, the three of them sat close, warmth radiating between them. For the first time in years, Helen felt truly free. Spring returned to the Crawford house, bringing with it a new breath of life. The front lawn, once neglected by Richard, grew lush and green again. Helen carefully planted tulips along the walkway, fragile yet proud blooms, just like herself. Now rising after the storm, stronger and more beautiful than before. After a morning in the garden, Helen opened the living room door. No longer filled with Richard's tense meetings or urgent phone calls, the space had been transformed into a small classroom. She set up a wooden table, hung a whiteboard, and welcomed students coming for literature tutoring. The giggles, the scratch of pencils across paper's simple sounds, yet they filled her heart to the brim. One parent once clasped her hand, voice choked. Mrs. Crawford, because of you, my daughter is no longer afraid of literature. She's learned to tell stories with her whole heart. Helen smiled, feeling a pride she had long forgotten, buried under years of being only the backdrop to her husband's life. Daniel, after his storm of anger, finally found focus again. He had just signed his contract with a major law firm in New York. Before leaving, he told his mother, "I want to be an honorable lawyer, not like the way Dad did business. I want to stand for those who've been abandoned, the way you once were." Helen embraced her son, seeing in his eyes a maturity she had never seen before. Lily had been accepted into a research program on child psychology. Every evening, she called her mother full of excitement, telling her about case studies, about her belief that she could heal the wounds of children just like the ones she had once carried herself. Helen always listened, sometimes laughing at her daughter's excessive passion. But deep inside she knew. The scars Richard left had guided Lily onto a meaningful path. One afternoon, after her class had ended, Helen was tidying up when Daniel and Lily walked in, holding a large bouquet. "Mom," Lily said, "we just wanted to give you something small to thank you for never giving up." Helen looked at her children, her eyes misting. The bouquet was simple tulips and carnations, but to her, it was proof. True family love can never be destroyed, no matter how someone tries to tear it apart. Meanwhile, Richard lived like a ghost. After the wedding collapse, Marissa vanished with her children, leaving no trace. Business partners gradually distanced themselves. No one wanted to be associated with the man mocked as the CEO abandoned at his own wedding. Richard lost his position, moved into a small rented apartment, and drove an old car instead of his once luxury sedan. Helen heard bits of news through old friends, but she didn't care. She was too busy living rather than looking back. One quiet evening, Helen invited a few friends over for dinner. She cooked herself, put on soft jazz, and for the first time in years, she laughed, truly laughed, not the forced smile she had once worn to hide her sorrow. A friend whispered, "Helen, you look different. As if you finally laid down a heavy stone." She nodded, replying simply, "I've stopped holding my breath." Sometimes Thomas Hale dropped by as well. He was no longer just the cold lawyer, but a companion. They sat together in the living room, sipping tea, talking about books, about her students. Once, Thomas asked, "Do you ever regret it, Helen? Everything that's happened?" Helen was quiet for a moment, then smiled. "If not for all of it, I might never have found myself. Sometimes, losing everything is the only way to truly begin." That night, Helen stepped onto the balcony. Above her, the sky was filled with stars. She remembered herself a year ago, woman who waited up for her husband, striving to please, afraid of being left behind. That woman was gone. In her place stood Helen of the present, independent, confident, cherished by her children. Inside, Danielle and Lily were talking excitedly about summer plans. Helen heard their laughter, and her heart warmed. She knew, though her 23-year marriage had ended in betrayal, from its ruins, a new family had been reborn, a family not built on a man who walked away, but on genuine love. Helen whispered, softly, as if to herself, "We're okay. In fact, we're better." The stars above twinkled in reply, as if to affirm her truth. And for the first time, Helen no longer feared the future, because that future she was building with her own hands day by day. Autumn returned, carrying with it the gentle scent of fallen leaves and soft golden afternoons blanketing the town. The Crawford house, now solely Helen's, had been transformed. The living room walls were repainted a warm beige, family photographs hung neatly on the walls, and Richard's old office had become a bright reading nook. Helen sat by the window with a cup of hot tea, listening to Daniel and Lily's voices drifting from the kitchen. Their laughter made her feel that everything was finally back in its rightful place. Richard's life was very different. He lived alone in a small suburban apartment, all traces of luxury gone. His expensive car had been sold, replaced by a worn-out sedan. Evenings stretched long and empty. He often sat in silence, calling Daniel or Lily, but most times his calls went unanswered. On the one occasion Daniel picked up, his voice was cold. "Dad, I don't hate you. But I can't forget how you disrespected Mom. When you truly know how to apologize, maybe things will change." Then the line had gone dead, leaving Richard alone in the dark. Helen no longer followed his decline. She didn't need to know how. Far Richard was falling. Her focus was on planting new seeds in her own life. Her small classes grew with more and more students. She joined the town's book club, meeting each week with women of similar paths, some divorced, some widowed too. Share and encourage one another. They called themselves the Leaves of Renewal. One evening, after a meeting ended, Helen stepped outside and found Thomas Hale waiting by his car, holding a file. He smiled, his eyes warm. "I stopped by the courthouse today. I brought you the final copy of the divorce papers. It's all done, Helen. Nothing binds you anymore." Helen took the file, her hand trembling slightly. She opened it and saw the bright red stamp. Divorce officially granted. In that moment, she exhaled deeply, not from bitterness, but because she was truly free at last. Thomas hesitated, then said softly, "Helen, I know we met through work. But after everything, if someday you'd like to have coffee or just talk outside of legal matters, I'd be glad to." Helen laughed the first. Genuine laugh she'd had in years. "Thomas, I'll think about it. I promise it won't take me 20 years to answer." They both laughed, and in their eyes something quietly began to grow, not rushed, not forced, simply a new possibility. That night, Helen sat on the porch with Daniel and Lily, wrapped in blankets. They sipped hot chocolate together, watching maple leaves drift down in the yard. "Mom," Lily whispered, "I'm so proud of you. You didn't just survive, you showed us how to face the truth." Daniel nodded, placing a hand on his mother's shoulder. "You taught me that strength isn't about revenge. It's about rebuilding. That's why I chose law, to defend people like you." Helen listened, her eyes glistening with tears. She knew she no longer needed Richard to define her worth. The love of her children, the pride she had reclaimed, and even the possibility of opening her heart to a new future, these were enough. In the distance, church bells rang, heralding the coming holiday season, but this time, Helen no longer feared Christmas or any anniversary. To her, each passing day was itself a new beginning. She lifted her face to the sky and whispered, "Sometimes, losing everything is not the end. It's simply the chance to choose again in a better way." Daniel and Lily exchanged a glance, then leaned their heads against their mother's shoulders. In her embrace, they knew their family had not been destroyed, had been reborn. Stronger than ever, Helen closed her eyes, listening to the autumn wind stir the leaves. She didn't know where the future with Thomas might lead, but she knew one thing for certain: the path ahead belonged to her, free of anyone else's control. And for the first time in years, Helen truly smiled with the quiet certainty that every choice from now on would be her own. For me, the most powerful moment in this story was when Daniel and Lily stood tall and declared, "We choose to stand with Mom." That wasn't just the choice of two children, was living proof that love and respect can never be bought with money or empty promises. What about you? Which moment struck you the most? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to like and subscribe to Snail's Story, so every week we can continue to walk together through stories filled with heartbreak, resilience, and hope.